afternoon, Joe. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
I've had the privilege of watching you on this morning's HPRCT monthly webinar. And I just want to say I gleaned a lot of information, as my notes from the morning will prove to. I wanted to discuss a little bit about some of the items that you talked about. You were talking about measurements, and that's measuring success or failure is a really big aspect of what we do in the safety world. And you mentioned that Kathy O'Neill, in a TED Talk that you watched, mentioned in discussing data analytics that data can be weapons of mass destruction.
That's right.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit for me, please?
Sure. I love the term because it kind of summarizes the experiences I've had throughout my career with different organizations, where the person who creates the metric doesn't understand the method that it takes to reach that metric, leaves destruction in their wake. For instance, an organization believes that they don't hear nearly enough low-level events happening in the workplace, the things that don't have a consequence yet, where there are no injuries, there are no accidents, there's there's very little defects in their process, but humming in the background is a constant reminder that it could happen. So they wait until it gets too late to fix the things that are relatively silent, and then the worst thing happens. We we call that separating the noise from the signals. And sometimes it's just noise. It's an anomaly, a one-off. Other times it's a strong signal that's not being used to try and improve your process before you have to. And so, in that math destruction, we'll put out a new metric for reporting near misses. And we're going to reward people, incentivize them, perhaps sanction them by punishing them if they don't start fessing up to some of those near misses. The problem with that is that if that is not articulated well in terms of purpose and process, you will have people submitting all kinds of near misses that don't matter. I shared earlier this morning that one of the problems with Deepwater Horizon, as seen by the regulators after the event, when 11 people lost their life and 5 million gallons of oil was spilled in the sea, that they were focused more on counting the number of coffee spills that had been cleaned up rather than oil spills that could be created. And the math in each of those causes you to go down a different road. If you're looking for the everyday things that bother everybody the most, they may not matter the most.
We had
But
several things going on in that Deepwater Horizon story, but when Misha and OSHA wrote the final report, I think they had a rather enlightening statement here for anybody who is managing safety processes. They said, having achieved a false sense of safety through observation programs that focused more on coffee spills than they did on oil spills, failure caused by organizationally accepted habits claimed the lives of 11 people and spilled over 5 million barrels of oil. Now, I love that phrase because I've been guilty of that myself. Focusing more on the things we can easily manage rather than the things that have to be managed. And so safety glasses that aren't worn, hard hats that aren't on, work packages that aren't being used. And yet, are we asking the workers the things that matter most to them that will affect us the most in the end? Coffee spills rather than oil spills.
but if you don't ask questions about what matters the most, you'll never go looking for it. So destruction leaves a wake based on the math you're using, and you have to be very careful about how you express and communicate the things that need to be measured.
Absolutely. As you were talking this morning, it reminded me of a previous employer that I worked for. I worked in the solar industry, and for those that don't know, residential solar panels have to connect to the grid, and it's a process called interconnection. And we were instituting KPIs at the company, and one of the KPIs was number of interconnection documents submitted each week or each day. And it didn't take into account the number of times that those interconnection documents needed to be resubmitted because there was
Ah,
error on them. And I think that alludes a little bit to a discussion that a train of thought that you had where you mentioned that positive quantitative results don't equal positive qualitative results. Can you elaborate a little bit on that for me?
Yeah, and that goes right along with that whole math process. It's real easy to count numbers, and so that's why we do it. Especially senior managers, they just want to see proof that the results are being obtained, and numbers are the way they do it. And so, and it doesn't have to be lost workday cases or OSHA recordables. It can also be defects, compliances, non-conformances. We keep track of all those numbers because they're easy to measure. You have the standard, and you're not meeting it. Uh, and but the problem is that doesn't in any way speak to the qualitative process that got you there. We do a lot of observations in the workplace, and we teach organizations how to properly conduct an observation. And almost immediately, because managers are driven by numbers traditionally, one of their senior managers will say, "Well, we need to know the number of observations we want our people to do out in the field." Problem is again, the wake of distraction that's created is they aren't done in the field. They're done at their desk. They're done during lunch. They're not going to meet that 24 observation numeric uh, goal they had. So they start ripping them off 6 at a time in one day, and no quality whatsoever is given to any of those. It's the qualitative analysis, the quality of the observation you're doing that matters, the quality of the conversation you're having. I mean, think about it. How often have you called a call center for help? And that call center may be keeping track of how many minutes they took because that's a sign of inefficiency, yet there was no quality in that discussion. You walked away as the customer thinking, that didn't help me at all. And I don't know if I'm better off for it. And so qualitative processes have to have qualitative measurements, and they are difficult, and that's why they're not usually done.
Would you say that this is due to a conflict in priorities?
Yeah, I think a conflict in priorities, and just that's a great way of looking at it, as well as a conflict in values. And I always start with values first, the things that you don't have to measure because you would do them anyway. And if you are measuring them, it says a lot about your organization. I'm going to speak a little safety heresy for a second and a little provocative because some people are going to disagree, but I am a firm believer that safety is not something you measure. Safety is something you experience because you're measuring the right things. And that's hard for people to hear. Dan Foster, who I greatly respect, is one of the Foster family members of the Foster Farms family that I had a great opportunity to work with. His workers in the field, his managers at the ranch houses. And I will tell you, they have had a firm policy for years that safety is not a statistic ever to be brought up in a staff meeting or any other meeting except where you're talking about safety for the individual and for the process. So they don't have a meeting where they bring up this week's safety stats along with quality stats, along with productivity stats, because that does not put safety in a place of reverence where it belongs. Dan told his people years ago, safety is the only metric that has a face. There is no other metric that we measure that has the personality behind it, a human being suffer harm from it. Everything else we measure doesn't fall into that category. So why would you include it as if it didn't mean anything? I think it was a strong word from a great leader. And so safety has a place of reverence. And so when we say we're going to measure safety, the unfortunate part is that's I'll give you a corollary. Scott Geller of behavior-based safety fame, who mentored me in behavior-based safety back when I was a 29-year-old impressionable new manager. He said, Joe, you know what nobody ever has to remember? To put their clothes on to go to work. Nobody has to remember that. Why? Because it's a value. You don't have signs up saying 100% of our people remember to wear their clothes today. And so that's a good thing. But you know why nobody keeps track of that? Because it's a value, it's not a priority. You don't measure things that are of value. And so on the call this morning, somebody, and I felt their pain or their discomfort with their own organization, they set productivity goals with safety goals. And at times they're at odds with each other, like your question about the conflict of priorities. Well, if I'm a senior leader in a company and I have to have a separate measurement for safety to ensure that people aren't confusing productivity with safety, I have deeper problems in the organization than I'm aware of. If I got to tell you to have a balanced approach to safety and production, that's a priority. And the problem is safety is not a priority, it's a value. So how can I, as a senior leader, support you and I understanding this value that we would never do otherwise? I would never ask you to take on too much, do too little with too little resources, um, take on a bigger goal than you can achieve. Why would I do any of that if I really regarded your safety as a value? And so I think we need to go back and recalibrate the organization to see what we're measuring and why we're measuring it.
So in a practical sense, because that seems like a tall order for a large number of companies out there, in a practical sense, how can companies even get started on that process?
Yeah, that is really the mystery behind the math, but it's worth pursuing. That's the whole point. It's worth pursuing, and for me, the number one, you got to go back and take a look at who you are. What is the purpose of our organization? My favorite question to ask anybody in any position is, who would miss you the most, or who should miss you the most if you were missing tomorrow? If all of a sudden you turned up and you weren't around, hey, I'll tell you what, if they can go on without you, what's that mean? And I've worked with leaders who said, no, that's great. That just means I've done my job to delegate them responsibility and accountability so that they can get it done without me. Well, then I would say that you have been doing their job that they should have been doing. So what's the job that you should have been doing? So you're right. Uh, and you're wrong. Because here's the point. Your position exists for a reason. You're important for a reason. You do the things you do because nobody could or should be doing them, because you fill in the blank space that the organization would be missing otherwise. So who are you? Why do you exist? And then number two, how do we measure that? How do we measure the value you bring to the table? And that's where the fun, hard work. See, people avoid it. Later on, I'm going to do a workshop with some coaches and mentors in the field. And they've been asking senior leaders, hey, when we're out there with your folks, what is it you want us to do? What are your expectations for us? And almost all of them said, I don't know. I don't know. You guys are out there. You guys know your business. Just do something. And so they said, well, it's hard to know if you're doing the right thing if you don't know what that thing is. And so we're going to work with, okay, what's the purpose of a coach? What's the purpose of a mentor? If you were missing tomorrow, what would they be missing about you? And then here's the big aha. How are you going to measure it? How do you measure it? And so we'll be taking what I believe several authors have written up recently, lots of research done in this, getting away from the performance indicators that speak to compliance, meaning the numbers of things we're doing, and looking at the health indicators that speak to the value in the organization of how we're changing, the improvements that are being made. Easy to measure the non-compliances. More difficult but important to measure how you're not having non-compliances. Why is it you're not falling into that trap of having to fix things because you're waiting until they're broken? What are you doing up front proactively to keep that from happening? And that's the story that organizations need to tell. And it takes work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I don't want to take up a whole lot more of your
I
time.
appreciate it.
Is it possible for you to send me some links to those books so I can include them on our YouTube channel there so people can access them right away?
Absolutely.
Wonderful. And maybe we'll follow up in a couple months after you've had that workshop with those mentors to hear the outcome of that. So thank you, Joe. Again, it was a great presentation. HPRCT is very lucky to have you. So thanks for letting me pop on this morning. It was very insightful.
Jessica, I'm the lucky one to be able to answer these questions that you come up with and to work with such a great group of folks who are as interested in changing a community of thinkers as the people I've been associated with. So I appreciate it.
Wonderful.
You bet.